Hi, my name is Terry Wise, and I'm the author of a book entitled Waking Up Climbing Through the Darkness. And I travel all over the country speaking to organizations and groups about topics related to mental health. I would love to come and speak to your organization or group. There's a number of things that I do speak about, and primarily trying to get a message of hope across to people. I survived a near-fatal suicide attempt after the death of my husband. It turns out I had a long history of depression, and it's one of the things that I call upon when I do speak to people is to let them know that I've actually walked the walk, and I've actually been there and had the personal experiences that I can draw upon to let them know that there is hope. There is hope. There's a lot of people that feel hopeless, that feel that they're stuck in a situation that they can't change. And many times I tell people probably the most important thing I have to say is what I'm not saying, and that's that I can stand before them and tell them that I am a living example, that it is possible to go from the depths of despair to feeling joy again. Okay, so I'll start off by giving you the intro that I actually always start off my speeches with. I usually start off by sharing some rather graphic details with people. And it's not for the shock value. There's actually a purpose to it. If I could get past this without having to share these details, I would. But I think it's really important for people, when they're hearing from someone who's had a personal experience, to know how far down you've been so that they can see how far someone can come. And I never want to run the risk that there's anyone sitting there in my audience saying to themselves, well, she was depressed or down and out, but not as down and out as I am, or she was depressed, but not as depressed or upset as my client or my patient is. So it's really to deliver a message of hope. I will start off by telling them that on Christmas morning of the year 2000, I swallowed 200 Percocets and 60 doses of morphine with a pint of gin. And 2 days later, I woke up and I found myself in ICU and then on a liver transplant floor of a local Boston hospital. It's actually a very prestigious hospital in Boston. I live in the area. And I woke up in ICU and then ended up on the liver transplant floor of that hospital for about a week. And there's an enzyme in your liver. It's called an ALT. And the normal ALT count for a healthy liver is 50. My ALT count was 18,000.
Good boy.
So needless to say, it still remains a medical mystery how I survived that attempt, how I'm sitting here today. No one's been able to figure it out. People will often ask me, did you need the liver transplant? What happened? I didn't. My liver fully recovered. To date, truly, there's no medical explanation for it, but I did recover. And what preceded that attempt, just let me rewind for a minute, was my husband's death. 3 weeks before our wedding, my husband Peter was diagnosed with ALS, which is also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Are any of you familiar with ALS,
Yeah.
Lou Gehrig's disease? For any of you who are not, it's a fatal, untreatable neurological disease that causes a progressive paralysis throughout your entire body, and your mind is left unaffected, so that inevitably you become trapped inside a motionless body until you die. And the best description I ever heard of Lou Gehrig's disease was someone once said that if Lou Gehrig's disease was a book, Stephen King would have written it. And so it began with Peter's speech. A few weeks before our wedding, we found out that he had this illness, and it took about 4 years to take its course through the rest of his body. He claimed his life in 1999, and that left me as a 35-year-old widow. And my suicide attempt occurred about a year later. And a lot of people immediately assume that the reason that I made the attempt was because Peter died. And I can tell you that there's no question that losing him was an enormous part of the equation. Maybe it would have been enough standing on its own. I actually suspect it probably would have been. But I later learned, when I was in treatment with a very talented psychologist, her name is Dr. Betsy Glazer, I learned that it wasn't necessarily the result of Peter's death as much as it was the consequences of a lot of other things that I had experienced. 4 years of full-time caregiving and the toll of that. Going back to figuring out my first suicidal thoughts. The first time I remember having suicidal thoughts was when I was 10 years old. So we also uncovered, and I started to finally talk about, a long history of being abused as a child, sexually abused as a child. So I always tell people, when you experience any kind of a trauma or significant loss as an adult or even a young adult, anything that's happened in your life that's been on simmer comes to a full boil. So it's so much more than meets the eye, and a lot of people will look at suicide as something that stands alone. Suicide prevention is this topic, and it stands all by itself. And one of the things that I wanted to get across to you folks today is that it doesn't stand alone. It doesn't just happen out of nowhere as the result of nothing. It's always the result of something. It's the result of an untreated mental illness. It's the result of a catastrophic event. Your whole family's killed in a plane crash, and you wake up with suicidal feelings. Or, as in my case, it's the result of an accumulation of experiences. So, one of the things that I always make it a point to speak about to people, and what I wanted to get across to you folks today, is that there is an interrelationship between all of the topics that I speak about. I speak to a lot of different groups. I speak to groups that do hospice care, bereavement counselors, people that work with patients with long-term physical illnesses, people that work with patients with long-term mental illnesses, and you can't separate them from each other. They're always interconnected in some way. So, for example, if you're talking to a number of people who work with patients or clients that have been bereaved, you better bet that they also need to hear information about suicide prevention. There's a lot of bereaved people have suicidal thoughts. People in their lives who are caregivers, it's very likely that they're also going to be experiencing depression. And I always tell people whenever I have the chance to speak to anybody who is working with caregivers to always make it a point to let them know that you also work with patients. Because when you work with a caregiver and when you work with a patient, one of the things you want to do is find the best care possible for that patient. And one of your most primary resources is the caregiver. So if you're working with patients, you also want to find a way to alleviate the burdens that are on caregivers and help them so that they can take care of patients better, and so forth and so on. So one thing I learned early on is you have to know your audience, and what I'd say to one audience is not what I'd say to another. Whenever I speak to college kids or young adults, my primary focus is to present a living example that it's possible. I speak a lot about my troubles as a kid so that they can realize that it didn't just happen because of things I experienced as an adult. So one of the ways in which I can relate to them is to let them know that I was depressed and suicidal as early as 10. I was hospitalized for being suicidal when I was in college. So these experiences have been with me for a long time. And one of the things I think that kids need to hear more than anything is that there's hope. I mean, it's really the primary message for everyone. And I know it probably sounds like it should go without saying, but it doesn't. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of kids, especially young adults, that feel very trapped by their circumstances, economically or for other reasons. They can't leave whatever misery they find themselves in, and there's also a stigma. And so they don't want to come forward if they're depressed. They don't want to come forward if they're sad or suicidal because of the stigma and because of the fear. So I always try to get a couple of points across to them. But number one is that depression isn't a character flaw. That people think of it as a sign of personal weakness. And I always tell them that actually a sign of personal strength is recognizing that you're depressed and reaching out for the help you need. It's just the opposite. I also focus a lot on the benefits of talking about how you're feeling, because, and this goes for adults as well, but especially young adults, many of them get stuck in this very self-destructive cycle, and they start thinking, well, what's the point of talking about how I'm feeling? Nothing's going to change. My parents are getting divorced. My girlfriend broke up with me. Whatever the problem is, it's unchangeable. What's the point? And the number one thing I try to get across to them, whether it's young adults or adults, is that talking about how you're feeling is not necessarily to change the circumstances of your life. You may not be able to change them right now. It's to help you feel less alone. And that's what I try to do, is encourage these kids to feel less alone and to do things that will help them feel less alone. And one of them could be talking about how they're feeling. Another can be just seeing a living example of someone who has survived it and can tell them from personal experience. So there's a lot of different things that I will focus on, but it's always about messages of hope. I try to also, I know you won't find this anywhere in the literature. I know it's very unorthodox, but I also throw in some guilt works. Jewish background, I guess. But it's true. I also help them to understand their impact, the impact they would have on others if they did take their lives. And when I have adults and I'm doing continuing ed seminars, I'll actually have them write out an impact inventory. If you died, who would be impacted? And there's a lot of people they don't even think of. Their friends' parents, the psychologist who's treating them, their teachers' families, and so forth and so on. So I try to help them understand. And it's not just to make them feel guilty. It's also to point out their value. I mean, that's a major component of suicide prevention, is educating people about signs and risk factors. And again, you'd think that would go without saying, right? I mean, everybody can tell if someone's depressed. Everyone can tell if someone's in trouble, but they can't. I have my best friend of 30 years, bring me to the emergency room not knowing what was wrong with me, found me incoherent at home he came to visit me, and he didn't know what was wrong with me, and he took me in, and he didn't know that I had made a suicide attempt, and the doctors didn't know I had made a suicide attempt. And all it would have required is for them to be educated about signs and risk factors. And they could have put it together. If somebody in the ER, for example, and how I'm equating this is with teachers and other students, but if, say, in the ER, there was anyone there at any capacity that was educated about the signs of suicide, they could have sat down with my friend in the waiting room and said, listen, I just got a few questions for you. Has anything significant happened in her life recently? And they would have found out my husband died a year earlier. Was she under any other unusual stress? They would have found out I was his full-time caregiver. Do you know if she's had any drastic changes in behavior since her husband died? Yes, she's lost a lot of weight. Yes, she started to drink more alcohol. Yes, she started to talk to me about new estate plans. And they would, but see, those things standing alone, my friend hadn't put all the pieces together. A huge part of it is educating them about signs and what to do when they do recognize the signs. A lot of people say, okay, I recognize the signs, but who do I tell? What do I say? Where do I go? And I always remind people that, if you have to choose between potentially losing a friend or losing your friend's life, what's going to be easier for you? Or what's going to be less difficult, really?
That's great.
A lot of people look at the work that I do. I hear from people all over the country who do this work with in the helping professions, but I experience it too. When people, will hear about the topics that I present about or what I've written about, and they'll immediately think, "Wow, that is so depressing." And the thing is that, they're depressing topics, but the overall message is hope. And that's why, if you talk to anybody, everybody gets a high from helping other people. And it's about helping other people. And I've met people that work on suicide crisis lines that say it's the best job in the world because they get the high from helping other people. And it's, that's what it is. I was watching this show on PBS about kindness, and it was talking about how 3 people benefit from kindness: the people offering it, the people receiving it, and the people who are witnesses to it, the bystanders. And there actually is a change in your physiology, endorphins and serotonin levels and so forth and so on. And if you listen to anybody that's had a sad event in their life, what are the things that they talk about the most? You'll always hear people comment on, my mother died, the nurse that came into the room was so kind. When the EMTs came to our house, there was one EMT that he just touched my shoulder and he was so kind. And you're going to hear that over and over and over and over again. So please don't underestimate the power of compassion and letting people know that there's help and that there's hope and there's someone that cares.